Hi everyone, I'm Urška from Landezine, and let me first introduce our guest today, Denise Hoffman Brandt, whom we will talking about her book and basically topics she opens through our conversation. So Denise Hoffman Brandt earned her educational credentials at the University of Pennsylvania in art history, continuing painting at Pratt Institute, and concluding with studying landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to holding a professorship at the City College of New York, she was an adjunct and visiting professor at Columbia University and Pratt Institute as well. She was also a project manager at Michael van Valkenburg Associates and a senior landscape architect at Matthew Nielsen Landscape Architects before establishing her own practice, Hoffman Brandt Projects, where among other topics, she engages in activist design for crisis situations and critical mapping, say uranium activities across the US or gun cartridge distribution found after the 2015 Baltimore protests. In the following conversation, we will go through the points from the text that is an expert from already mentioned book Denise is currently working on trees and beasts. Please correct me if, and apart from that, Denise, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Pleasure is on our side as well. So let's briefly outline the book and the thread you're developing through the text you've shared with me, which we will talk about.
So the book started, 18 years ago, actually more like 19 now. It keeps growing. And it started really as a kind of exploration of how we sync our economic thinking of boom and bust cycles with the built landscape. And I was driving around the Western US looking at stuff. And it took me years of thinking about this, trying to figure out what I was actually trying to understand. I knew that what I was looking for was what I thought nature was, because even as an instructor in landscape architecture, which I was at the time, even then, I felt like the distinction between landscape and nature was so blurry that it was hard for me to teach it. I did tell my students not to use the word nature, because I always found that they were confusing a kind of moral judgment with the physical realm, and that they were not handling that messy mixture very well. And I knew I wasn't handling it either. I was trying to parcel off a lot into the definition of landscape. So over these years and reading a lot of stuff in between and teaching, and I want to thank all of my students that I've had, because a lot of what I talk about in the book is stuff I discussed with them. And, every little bit helps. So the book itself, it started out trees, beasts, water, rock, air. It got so unwieldy after trees and beasts that I decided I had to separate out living organisms. And a lot of that had to do with the realization that I started to see it when I was writing the chapters on trees, which are a chronicle of a road trip up the Markagunt Plateau, and the beasts as well in Utah. And you're basically going from the west side of the Colorado Plateau up the face of the Colorado Plateau through this creek. And as I got up there, in the snow and sleet with my 2-year-old in the back seat and my mother in the passenger seat complaining about my driving, I saw all these dead trees. And it turned out that 95%, something like that, of the spruce in the area had been killed. And I didn't know it at the time. They had been killed by bark beetles. So as I'm driving up in this snowy landscape and all I see is dead trees, it was something out of a horror movie in a weird way. And so that always stuck with me. And then as we got to the top and I drove south, and, it was a day of driving that just encompassed what I thought was everything I think of as the phenomena of nature: trees, beasts, water, rock, and air. And so that became the framework for the book I'm working on. And I finished Trees and Beasts. I'm doing a revision and tying up the loose ends, but it's written for the general public because along the way of thinking about all this and thinking about where landscape architecture fits in with the idea of nature, I realized that landscape is a piece of it, and the way landscape architecture has situated itself as a practice has actually confined its territory within what I think of as nature. That by denying, by dancing around political issues, by being not straightforward about how emotional intelligence is part of a way to understand landscape beyond a kind of aesthetic, by denying a lot of the things that are wrapped up in these confusing ideas of nature, because nature is an idea. It's a bunch of moral judgments we attach to physical phenomena. The physical phenomena are not nature. They're physical phenomena and forces. I realized that I wanted to talk to people that were not designers, because in order to change designing, in order to design better, we have to be able to work. And as a service industry that, and this is why I think landscape architecture and all of the design disciplines, I think have sort of cornered themselves a little bit by emphasizing the service industry. And I realize it is very hard to make a living in design. I'm not criticizing that it's a service industry. My work, I decided I had the luxury of being a professor, it could be speculative, and that allowed me to do speculative work. But I think that there's a real dearth in the profession of speculative work. There's a real lack of voices who are saying what we're doing is wrong. And that has to happen. We have to be self-critical. And there's a lack of teaching how to understand dealing with conflict, how to disagree, how to say, I think what you're doing is wrong. Let's talk about the, why you're doing this, the ontology, where does this go back to? All of these discussions are mostly, not entirely, kept out of design discourse. And if we want to affect the way people live and we want to design for the way people live, we have to have these conversations. So Trees and Beasts, I talk in Trees about this issue, how to think about loss, how to understand the tree's demise, how to situate trees in relation to humans. That mandates talking about a lot of philosophy. It got even crazier when I started writing about beasts. And I was writing about the bark beetles themselves. And I do not like bugs. I can't stand to be around bugs. And so to be writing all of this about beetles and having to look at beetles all the time, that in itself was an education, because I had to confront my own biases. And that, of course, became highly philosophical, because there you're not just sort of sidestepping how Christianity has framed trees as this kind of, stasis makes them mute organisms. They have no life. They don't have agency because they are still. And then you get to beasts, which, are moving and presumably have some kind of agency. And that brings us to Thomas Nagel, which you mentioned when you reached out to me. His question, defying the materialist viewpoint, saying, what is it like to be a bat? And that there is something that it is like to be a bat, that it has a subjective consciousness, possibly, likely, really changed how I thought about things. And so I will say this, the book, it's changed because I've changed. And, asking all these questions and having to go back and read Kant's, God help me, we should all have to do that. We should all have to explain why Kant thought that animals should not be part of the moral realm, and that goes back to Aristotle's idea of the scala naturae, that humans are at the top because they have reason or possibly souls, and everything else is below humans because they're not rational. And I would argue that attitude is that ontological positioning of humans in nature is what underlies not just our environmental travesties, but also our social injustices, because that constantly setting up a hierarchy, there's all kinds of ways to parse that ladder. And so a lot of the book is started to turn into how we're parsing that ladder when we talk about nature. All right, I've talked a lot, now you ask a question.
Yes, basically we're here to debunk Ian McHarg. That's the main, because he's the first you would encounter as a student of landscape architecture, and he's ultimately famous Design with Nature book. And he's also a pioneer basically in landscape architecture as a profession, or landscape planning as such, covering multiple maps and kind of holistically in a way looking at the environment or surroundings, or basically at a region. And his tools he developed, however, they leave a lot of things out. What is not mapped, that's why it's also interesting you make critical mappings, which are on a totally different level and scale, or they use totally different information. But first, before debunking Ian McHarg, like, let's go a bit back. And I remember that as a student I was reading McHarg, but I quite like the book Conversations with Students, Dwelling in Nature, where he proposes creative fitting, meaning that each species is embedded in their environment in a creative way because they fit in the environment, meaning that creativity is not limited to human, which I found quite interesting.
I do wonder, I don't know, if McHarg was influenced by Henri Bergson in making that statement. His book, Creative Evolution, framed the evolutionary process, natural selection, as something that was generative, as opposed to a kind of linear trajectory, which is the way that the people that I argue hijacked Darwin's theory frame it, that it devolves to competition, whereas Bergson saw it as something much more animated. And Bergson's argument also was that humans had developed a sort of sophisticated rationale, a complexity that other species don't have. But he also argued that other species were completely capable of developing complexity. They had no need to, that it wasn't part of their, I would argue, if he had said it, that it wasn't part of their umwelt, that they just simply didn't need to extend themselves to the complexity that the human species had extended itself, but that they had the creative capacity. And so when you mentioned that, I was wondering if McHarg had been influenced by Bergson, who had been extraordinarily popular in the beginning of the 20th century. And then he actually debated Einstein and kind of won. But with the rise of physics and the hard sciences, the idea that technology could dictate outcomes just the way people used to think only God could dictate outcomes, Bergson's theories got kind of blown away. He got associated with vitalists, and so he was sort of pushed aside in this fundamental argument between materialism and idealism. So a materialist believes everything is completely physical, and an idealist believes that there are prior truths, that there are absolute things that shape the physical world. That's a really, reductive definition. And what McHarg was doing was, by making that argument that species are fit and that they're creative in their acts in adaptation, it's a bit contradictory, the argument, because to say that they're fit, is that because they are materially well suited to their environment, and they're just, a materialist doesn't believe that an organism has agency. a materialist believes they're machine-like. So that's not creative. And so his use of the term fit is confusing. And then when he talks about it being creative, you think, well, he's thinking about it as an idealist, and the idea of perfection slips in. The thought that, that other species are perfected to meet the challenges of their environment. And that's a fundamentally Christian vantage point. That's right out of the Judeo-Christian handbook, that idea of species being perfected. It was one of the reasons that Darwin's theory was, combated, because Darwin's idea of evolution said that God had not created perfected beings. So, I think McHarg's impulses to attribute agency to non-humans were really important. And I think it fits with his, the agenda of design with nature is to say we shouldn't design just for humans. I think the challenge he had was he couldn't get past his humanist vantage point that put him as the human who knew best for everything else, and even in suggesting that, human fallibility would lead to failure, there was always a kind of a linear ascendance implied that's embedded in the progressive attitude that we're always going ever upward. We're always getting better, that man is in ascent. And I think that reinforces all these ideas that we can fix things. And you know what? I think we proved over the millennia that we're not so great at fixing things, and that we might be better if we started to dance with things rather than try to corral them into a corner.
True, I can agree, but the thing is that when you say that we should invite all other species and other beings into to be agents of design as well, or to be considered when we are designing, if we propose their agency, how to know them all? This is and what is to know other creatures? How is to we always look? I mean, we had these discussions already. How to put yourself in a perspective of another animal or a plant. We often do like this plant like this kind of soil and stuff like that, and you need to create conditions, but it's very anthropocentric view as well, because we are in the end, of course, designing for ourselves as well. But what would this mean? Designing for all, basically. How is it?
So I think that very statement is kind of the crux of the problem. The idea that we're designing for. So that if you put yourself in the position that it is your mandate to understand the subjective consciousness of a bat, say, then you're putting yourself in the position that you will know them, and therefore you can do best for them. And that's fundamentally the McHargian position. And so what I'm talking about is a recognition in a way that there are other worlds, that the bat's understood world, the bat's subjective reality, is not our subjective reality. It understands its world differently, and it senses the world differently. We know bats sense through sonar. Looking at beetles, my deep dive into bark beetles of all things, it turns out that bark beetles have on their antenna at the same time smell and sense space. And so they move through their tunnels, they shape their tunnels with their antenna, but the antenna also are their nose. They're also smelling. And then it turns out that they have little hairs on parts of them. And those little hairs, those too are also smelling. So imagine you're a beetle and you're burrowing into tree bark, basically killing it. And you're you're chewing your way through it and you're excreting out your backside, the frass. And at the same time, you're kind of tunneling around and your whole body is smelling and feeling at the same time. Does it do us any real good to know that that's how a bark beetle, you know, we can imagine they understand their world? No, it does not. I mean, it may give us a certain amount of sympathy for the bark beetles when we're looking at the dead trees, but we aren't really approaching the way the beetle knows its world. How we know how the beetle knows its world is by, you know, how we see it intersecting ours. And I think this gets to the root of what ecology is. Ecology is about relationships. It isn't about the things. It's not the bark beetle and what the bark beetle knows. It's not the human and what the human knows about the bark beetle. It's how we establish the terms of our relationships. And if you can accept that the bark beetle has a subjective consciousness, then at least in all historic forms of moral judgment, you have to respect that as a living being, that you have to behave to a certain standard with. And that's when I talk about parity, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying we have to design so that the bark beetle has a comfortable tunnel or lots of spruce to kill. I'm saying we have to respect these cycles and scales of knowing the world and other umvelts that are not our own, and recognize that we are intersecting with them and respect them enough to try to accommodate as much as possible those other beings, right? So what do we do when we see the bark beetles have killed the spruce forest? Do we go out and try to kill all the bark beetles? No, we recognize they're actually a keystone species in the spruce forest. They're endemic to the spruce forest. Going out and killing them all is just going to make another problem. But our previous worldview of command and control says we should be the judge and, you know, kill the bark beetles. The bark beetles are just one example. When we look at how we build the city, we surface everything for people who wear shoes and cars and vehicles. Everything else is barefoot, basically. Why don't we have more spaces that accommodate that type of motion, that type of ground contact? No, we say we've got to have more stormwater management things. We've got to have all of this. But let's change the terms of the argument. Let's really look at what we're doing.
Yeah, I think if I return to the question of this all-knowing designer, I think like putting designer also in hands of being, I mean, in the position where the designer should know it all. You also said that of course we don't know, we don't understand other creatures, and we cannot. But how do you design then this respect? You know, how to design respect? Okay, you mentioned parity. So, but we often don't see what is all around us, what all is around us.
Right, right.
And maybe it's with relocating. So when we put some materials out of a space, like with soil or whatever, and then we pave it over. So yeah, we make conditions that, with the conditions, we exclude certain.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that we exclude nature in a whole, because we cannot. It's
No, we're always thinking about nature. I would say how our ideas of nature shape every decision we make. I am not saying we're excluding nature. Nature is, you know, how we think about our neighbor is very often influenced by these hierarchies we understand from how we think about what is natural.
okay.
But how we act and the things we do physically very often excise the very things that a lot of people call nature. And so, you know, my favorite thing is the advertisements that say that, you know, they're going into nature because they're going to a spa somewhere in the woods. You know, the idea that I once asked a class of architecture undergraduates looking out the window, I said, so what do you see out there that's nature? And they were completely stumped because it was, you know, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. And then finally somebody pointed to the crabgrass and said that was nature. And, you know, the fact that people can actually recognize that nature is an idea that we have made, that is a mixture of, you know, moral judgments and assumptions about physical phenomena, environmental forces, other living organisms, the material world. You know, the fact that is still muddy, that if you ask somebody what nature is, they can't give you a good answer, that is highly problematic. So when I say, how would we think about designing in the city that would accept, you know, that would change our way of understanding nature to respect other living organisms, and later, the next book, it's forces and phenomena that are more understood to be inert. That means that you think twice about how you're surfacing the ground. You think about what your priorities are. You think that, well, if I really want, you know, to have more birds in the city, I need to have more bugs. And, you know, if we may not want more birds now that there's bird flu around, you know, priorities are going to be quite crazy, but especially with climate change. So, you know, you ask yourself questions that don't just make assumptions. You don't just assume a certain type of species is a good thing to have. That species may be wiping out a lot of other species. But here's the deal. You don't know. You're not the judge. So your challenge is to respect it all. And that's why I think it's a kind of radical respect, because we're used to only respecting the things that we think are good. We need to respect the bark beetles too.
And that brings us to moral judgments as
Right.
well. I will point this out that I am deeply concerned about the trees in cities, when we're speaking about cities already. Often they don't have conditions. We want to we instrumentalize, as you said. Also, we want some species to cohabit, to live with us, and some species we absolutely don't like. So we produce trees. We hybridize them to fit our likings, to have smaller or none fruits, so they don't, you know, so they don't fall on the sidewalks and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we coerce them in the conditions that we humans created. So it's basically our hypocrisy in a way towards another living being. And I also believe that trees have their own consciousness or their awareness of their own bodies. We are basically acting bad towards trees. So I would forbid trees, and as well as domesticated animals that are in our apartments 8 hours or 10 hours a day, just because we like to be with them when we get home, you know.
I would say you're being just as authoritarian as an extractionist who's out there saying, let's cut all the trees down for lumber, right? You made a moral judgment.
Yes, but I'm putting myself in a tree perspective, you know? Like,
yeah, it doesn't matter. You're still assuming you can know the tree. You're still on top.
No, but yes, of course, because we in the city, you and as a landscape architect, you are on top. You see, this is also our problem.
No.
We are top-down viewers, you know. We get a plan, we can decide.
Okay, so if nature is an idea, and it's the idea that shapes how we understand ourselves in the world, then we are allowed to understand ourselves as having habitat that is meaningful to us too. We don't have to give away the farm, okay? Humans are allowed to have things humans want and need, just the way a bark beetle is allowed to have what it wants and needs, right? Just, thinking about, this is why the parity means everything matters. And, just like in natural selection, every organism matters because every organism is contributing to the genetic pool of mutations that's going to go one way or the other, right? So we need to think of it this way. All of our ideas, all of our wants and desires as humans making our habitat have value at some level, even the bad ones. And very often the bad ones, are very often, as in McHarg, stemming from really good impulses, from things we would consider to be morally just, good, right? So the idea of thinking for other species is not thinking for them. It goes back to, actually, I think McHarg had a good word with, that you have to have them in your mind. So, you look at Suzanne Simard's work, and she has identified the mechanisms by which trees will nurture, a mature tree will nurture seedlings, usually its own seedlings. It will actually, through its roots, send them nutrients so that they can mature. They've discovered that when the bark beetles attack the spruce actually, what the bark beetle is actually doing is it's actually, in a weird way, talking with the spruce when it attacks it. It's sensing these semiochemicals that the tree puts out, and it has semiochemicals that chemically relate to that, and it will attack trees it'll literally home in on a tree based on the chemical readings it's taking as it's flying around. It's not just like, oh, there's a tree, I'm gonna eat it. It's actually scoping the trees chemically. When it gets to the tree, it sends out other chemicals that call other beetles to the tree. And that's what actually kills the trees, is when you have a lot of beetles all at once. And because of climate change and having warmer winters and longer summers, the beetle reproductive cycle is vastly increased. So you have a lot more beetles out there. They send out their semiochemicals to aggregate. They all go to the same tree. And that's what effectively, over the space of the tree, will girdle the tree. So the beetles are doing something that we actually accuse humans of doing. They're killing the tree for their own ends, right? So I guess we're bad and the beetles are bad. What? It doesn't work. It's once you realize that we're all agents and we're all active, then you accept, yeah, we're going to want things. Should we have everything we want? No. Would it be great if all the beetles had every spruce they wanted? No, it kills the forest. If we have everything we want the way we're going, we're going to kill all the things that we rely on too. That's the way it is. It is not necessarily a moral judgment to want. It is dangerous to your outcome, your evolutionary future, if you want in a way that destroys the things you need, right? So trees in the city. Now we know that Suzanne Simard says the trees, and she was doing research for forestry. She didn't do that because she liked trees. She did that, she does like trees, but she was doing it because she wanted to make forestry more productive and also less damaging to the trees. So somebody in Parks Department here decides, I'm going to plant a whole bunch of trees because in a big tree pit, because now the trees can talk to each other, their roots, they'll protect each other. and I'm just going to make a forest. I'm a steward of nature. I'm the person, I'm in charge, and I'm going to make it better for trees. Okay, good. Fine, fine for the trees, fine for you. Highly problematic in terms of our collective future, because the argument that that steward makes is the same argument that an extractionist makes when they say they're going to cut down all those trees because that's what's good for our economy. That's what's good. And it really does keep families alive. It does give jobs to families. So unless we restructure a regional economy, they're right. They're doing a good thing. So a lot of what I'm getting at is that we need to stop making bad arguments that keep us just having weird oppositional moral judgments.
I see.
Right?
I see. But still,
it's not the planting of the tree that's the problem. It's the advertisement of doing a good thing that's the problem.
Exactly. Okay. But you mentioned also stewardship. That is basically a problematic word, and care you also use as a problematic. So how? Because it also gives us this right to do right.
Yes. I mean, a steward, it amazes me that that was the word that became emblematic of this mission to care. Because a steward is really, on a cruise ship, the steward is the guy who makes sure the passengers are comfortable, always within the parameters of the cruise and the captain and the economic outcome of the boat ride, right? The steward is not, they're empowered in a direct relationship with the passengers, but they're still underneath the authority of the political hierarchy. And so to me, that's emblematic of the challenges of saying you're going to steward nature, because it means you're put in a position where you're going to do the best thing for non-humans, because you're calling it nature, but what you're really talking about is non-humans. And yet you're going to do that within the political structures and hierarchies that have threatened those non-humans in the first place. So what are you doing?
Let's return to Ian McHarg, because it's, I think here, in landscape architecture profession, because here it comes highly problematic coming from this end of us being stewards, or being taking care of nature and designing with nature, or creating environments for certain species or for animals, for specific...
Let
yes.
McHarg live there.
Okay. What is the problem
Yes.
of McHarg's designing with nature? Or
I told that story in the book. It's actually, at the moment, it's in the introduction. And I put it in the presentation I gave to the class. And I should say, I had Ian McHarg's last studio at Penn. I actually sat in class with him and did map. That was where I was doing maps because I was a technical illustrator for archaeologists. So I had been doing maps before I met McHarg, but I did different maps when I met McHarg. But I told this story not so much to talk about the mindset of the steward in terms of caring for non-humans, plants, whatever, and actually being in authority over them, that being a problematic relationship. I told the story because I wanted to show how that is a problematic relationship. It causes a problematic relationship among other human beings as well. So I'm just gonna read this so I can get it straight. On projects around Greater Baltimore starting in the 1950s, the Office of Wallace and McHarg used suitability analyses, a quasi-scientific method of overlaying maps of local or regionally specific environmental conditions to assess opportunities and constraints for different types of land use. Because the mandate for development was itself never in question, The method was a mechanism to determine what must be city versus what should be nature. And as with many data-driven devices, McHarg's framing of the problem predicted his solution. Some places were better than others. So you have data that turns into a moral judgment. Referring to himself as the green-fingered planner, I should say a moral judgment without question, responsible for environmental conservation, McHarg called his partner David Wallace, making proposals for infrastructure, economic development, and legislative policy, the brown-fingered planner. In Design with Nature's chapter on A Response to Values, McHarg described his plan for the valleys commissioned by a voluntary nonprofit citizen group, that's their quote, of estate owners. Their former farmland had commodified scenic value that represented their social status. McHarg celebrated the group for preventing a wallpaper, this is his quote, a wallpaper of development from being unrolled on the landscape, as if the choice was either or, and it was not. David Wallace wrote later in his book, Urban Planning My Way from 2004, that the larger plan had advocated for his quote, relatively high densities and a cross-section of ethnic and income groups, unquote. That would be achievable with careful planning of circulation infrastructure and zoning code. And he pointed out that the landscape plan had armed the community with arguments against expanding circulation and septic infrastructure that served what he called, and this is a quote, an elitist conspiracy among the rich white landowners and the government they controlled to provide de facto segregation. The villagers chose to honor McHarg's idea of nature because it was a means to their end, sustaining the status quo of their status. So this is, when we think about nature without really questioning what nature is, without breaking it down and forcing ourselves to say, nature is an idea, and it's a whole bunch of messy ideas actually, and it influences how we do what we do in the physical world. We get things like this, where, you know, we hurt each other socially in the name of nature. Nature becomes something that as a steward we think we're protecting, and in doing so, we're harming other humans. That's not right either.
This is actually, it's a taboo theme, I think, within landscape architecture profession, because landscape architects are highly, which we don't like to say, because we like to say that we design for people, beautiful environments, useful environments, playscapes, greenscapes, and we are mitigating we are in such a demand now, also being like the co-leading profession against the climate change and water management and stuff like that, and it also puts us in another position, which is highly instrumentalized by politicians, and we are
if you're relying on landscape architects to solve climate change, you're in trouble.
Exactly. We are designers in the end. We're not even ecologists or some. So we like to overlook that we're instrumentalized heavily in the building industry or in space creation that is a lot of times going against us or our values. Even if we see it, we just go with the grain.
Right. And so here's what the only thing I can say that I think will help change any of this is people have to talk about this happening. Nobody wants to talk about it. I've tried to set up, symposia where people would have conversations about the challenges of designing against the grain, and designers don't want to talk about it. Why? I think certainly, outside of your professional life, you can do things in communities, you can write for publications that talk about these issues, that reveal the conflicts of interest that landscape architects face. I was at a conference once with planners where two of them announced that they don't talk to their clients about climate change because then they wouldn't get jobs. I find that just morally reprehensible, right? That's my moral judgment. I never, I think we should be clear that all of our ideas of nature are bogged down in moral judgments. And then we can have an argument about whether we think our moral judgment is right. I think your judgment about trees is authoritarian. We could talk about that.
I
There's
think
nothing
it's
wrong with having judgments. The problem is not talking about them.
a lot of talking and less doing, maybe even.
You know what? When I was in school, everybody was like, oh, it's all about, because there was a lot of writing. It was all about, well, it's all about right, it's all about talking and nobody's doing anything. Well, you know what? Everybody's doing, and people really need to be talking right now.
Exactly. Okay, about decolonization of landscape architecture, this is also this is kind of a topic
Right.
that we've covered a bit already. But if you have something to add there, lastly, I would also like you to talk about this emotional agency that is basically really important for you. And throughout the text I've read, I think it underlines the narrative you build. Basically underlines what we've left out in this technicist design process. That is basically maybe a way out, or maybe
Yeah.
come in handy.
Okay, so I think I can actually kind of connect all of that, or most of it. So the idea, when you talk about decolonizing disciplines like landscape architecture and removing the colonial mindset, very often that becomes a kind of tagline, and it's not really considered for what beliefs enable that mindset to be perpetuated. So, when I talk about questioning assumptions about hierarchies of being, we apply hierarchical ideas of being, and historically they have been applied to humans as well as non-humans. And a lot of the colonial mindset that has to be overcome is the fundamental idea that everything is on a ladder of value. And so when I talk about having parity, a kind of respect, pervasive or radical respect, what I'm saying is we have to eliminate that ladder of value. In doing so, that's a fundamental, support structure pulled out from the colonial mindset. That's a way to decolonize, is to do that. Another aspect of colonization was the assumption, and this came out of, as I discussed in the piece, Darwin's hijackers, the idea of survival of the fittest. That was not Darwin's term. That was Herbert Spencer's term. Darwin only adopted that in his later 10th edition, I think it was. And he did it reluctantly. He didn't actually agree with it because he believed that natural selection was a random process and not linear, not a trajectory for the better necessarily. And so if natural selection is random, then there is no potential better or worst human, because it's all just randomly evolving. Some are better, some are worse. There's no organization to it. There's no hierarchy. So by getting rid of this idea that got very much promoted in the last couple of decades, guys like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, who make a lot of noise. No longer Dennett, he died recently. Made a lot of noise about competition being what drives nature, the ideas of nature. if you allow competition to be the driver that is normalized and is natural, then you're giving license to selfish behavior. You're giving license to extractionists. But you're also giving license to people to oppress other people, that is somehow okay, ultimately, because it's natural. And so, you know, those ideas of nature that a lot of people carry around in the back of their minds and often in the front of their minds, those ideas of nature are what props up that colonial attitude. And so you can decolonize, but only if you really do start to change your fundamental beliefs about humans' relationship with the rest of the earthly cohort, the rest of everything on Earth. So, or the cosmos. So how that relates to, you know, my talking about, I tell the stories of Washu and Lucy, the chimps, and how they become, that their identities as research chimps, and they were being trained sign language and raised as kids. There was an idea that maybe apes, one of this idea of the latter, the idea of a culture being primitive, is to say that they are not as sophisticated, that they're a lesser development. Well, that's part of the structure that comes right out of ascent of man ideas. But that, again, does not go back to Darwin's natural selection, which is based in randomism. And Darwin's attitude was that diversity is beneficial, not something that should be controlled. So Lucy and Washu are chimps, and they're adopted and trained as children, and they're trying to teach them sign language, and they want to know how many words they can learn because that looks really good. It makes it, the idea was that if they could speak to humans, it would prove they were cognizant, as if you couldn't tell that they were cognizant if you just looked at them. And actually Jane Goodall had already proved that at Gombe in the early, well, starting in 69, I think. But this happened. And Lucy and Washu started to exhibit emotional, they started to convey emotional words, human emotional words. Lucy at one point described herself as dirty and said she was sorry, which implies, it asks the question, did she adopt a human moral judgment? And, you know, that is something that lies as far outside science as my saying bark beetles, you know, are having conversations with trees. Scientists do not want to acknowledge anything that can't be proved as material. And I worked in archaeology for years, and I remember how, you know, you couldn't read into something. It had to be materially proven. The archaeological record was actually it was like the dictionary of history. So, you know, there is reason for control of scientific investigation. You get crackpots who advertise things that are nuts. But there is also this weird balkanization that separates science from philosophical thought very often, separates it from emotion always, and separates it from, you know, in the case of Lucy and Washu, they could ask questions, were they expressing morality, but they couldn't actually say yes or no. It doesn't enable an answer. And yet, how we know the world, if nature is fundamentally an idea based on our feelings and our moral judgments and all this baggage we're carrying around, how can we not talk about it as valuable in dictating how we understand the world? And if we could talk about it, we could actually confront with much more grace, I think, some of the challenging assumptions that, you know, ideas of nature have put in front of us right now. You know, you have oppression of people, as we have, you know, migration is considered such a bad thing. And that's just, you know, because people are confronted with an affinity bias. There's all kinds of biases. Lucy Cook wrote this great book called Bitch about animals, that how actual animals debunk the stories of gender behaviors in animals. And it's great because she talks about how amazing Darwin was, and then she points out just how completely sexist Darwin was too. But it's, books like that talk about these issues that yeah, cause pain and trauma, but that can be taken on and say, look at what we really see if we ask a lot of questions. Those are the books that matter. That's a way to get past this. To not pretend male have a certain emotion, female have another, all those behaviors are secondary sex characteristics, and so on. You can actually start to talk about how behaviors are diverse, and we can't make rules. So you can't make your rule about trees.
Yeah, I mean, for some, not all, this would, if they don't have, like, this is my proposition, if they don't have a certain life supporting conditions, then they shouldn't be planted there. I will conclude with maybe this thought. So I will cite you from the text where you say, we don't need to rewild other species, we need to rescale ourselves.
A rescaling of our understanding of what we need and but also what we want. Just like there is very little questioning of, the corporate structure of landscape architecture as a profession, there's very little questioning about the roots of plastics, as you pointed out. I think it was before we started talking. And, that's a conversation where rescaling really matters. I did a studio with Elisabetta Tirani a few years ago called Unbuilding. And it wasn't so much looking at how we should take everything down as just how do you work with a mindset that not everything is about a kind of expansive permanence, which I think is what we really want to be questioning.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
thanks a lot. Bye.